Conservatives Charlie Kirk and Michael Knowles spoke about the Corona bailout bill. And what Charlie says here may surprise you. And I think there's a small chance that he would like to have these words back.
And they're already talking about another stimulus. And look, here's the long and short of it, is that middle America, real small business relief, the best stimulus they could have, Michael, is the green light to go back to work.
Of course,
that's what they want.
Course.
And so I understand it's not that simple, and I understand there's, all sorts of competing data and all that sort of stuff. However, I am of the opinion, like, hey, posting a $4 trillion deficit, that should be something that should be deliberated so thoughtfully and critiqued so carefully, not jammed through and passed in what I consider with some of the most egregious waste that I've seen in a bill in the history of the U.S. Congress.
And what's so scary here for conservatives is the precedent. Because listen, I'm fairly amenable to the bill. I can get behind a lot of aspects of it, but the sticking point for me.
You're more amenable than me, but finish.
I know I'm probably more amenable to it than you are, but the sticking point for me is we are now setting the precedent of the government on a massive scale sending direct checks to people because of a time of crisis. Well, look, maybe this is a serious crisis, at least an economic one. But what about the next time?
Yeah, but Michael, Medicare for all costs $32 trillion, but not $32 trillion a year.
That's right.
That number that Bernie said was over 10 years. So now we've set a precedent that $3 trillion a year for Medicare for all is not that much.
Yeah.
In fact, it's perfectly affordable. But UBI, why not do it every quarter? Why not every month?
Why not? I agree, Charlie. I agree. Yeah, he's actually making our case there. He's making our case there. If you give him credit for anything, it's that at least he's being consistent with his own ideology, whereas many so-called conservatives or so-called libertarians, they act like government spending is wrong, growing the deficit and the debt is wrong, and then, when it's inconvenient, they totally flip on that, and they're like, yeah, I'm completely in favor of the debt and the deficit and increasing government massively. He says, well, listen, you've set the precedent now that we could just do whatever, that we could just pay for whatever, that it's not really a question. It's not really like, oh, we have to tax to make sure we get every dollar and every cent for a spending program. You could just kind of do it. And it reminds me of what the clip that we played from the head of the Federal Reserve, and actually it was both heads of the Federal Reserve, one during the Great Recession, Ben Bernanke, and then the newer one, I think his name's Jerome Powell. And they said in no uncertain terms, yeah, we could kind of do whatever we want. And Ben Bernanke said, it's not, all we do is like move a decimal point on the screen at the Federal Reserve, and we just marked up the account, and then we're done. Now, I need you to understand something. This is under Democrats and under Republicans. This is under liberals and conservatives. This is the dominant philosophy, the dominant strain of thought in today's day and age. And it's like that for a good reason, because we've learned the lessons of history and what happens when you hit a giant economic crisis and you don't do that, and the government is not the spender of last resort. You exacerbate the economic crisis. Now, I would agree with Charlie that where you are directing those resources to is massively important, and our government does not direct them to the right places. However, where I disagree with him is his underlying point is like, hey, maybe we shouldn't just, spend trillions of dollars like that. I would say we absolutely can do that, and we should do that. We just need to spend it in the right ways. And what he alludes to at the end there, I've always said you should be bailing out the people when there's an economic crisis. Don't bail out the businesses. If anything, what should have happened with the businesses, and this will really make Charlie's head explode, is temporary nationalization. Because what happens now is you give these private businesses trillions and trillions of dollars overall, billions per company respectively, or per industry, whatever you want to say. And then they're going to go bankrupt in a year or two because nobody's like, if you're the cruise line industry, if you're the airline industry, great, you got bailed out. Well, guess what? Still nobody's flying. Still nobody's going on your terrible cruise ship. So you're going to come right back to the government hat in hand in a couple years asking for another bailout. Now, I agree that that's what's called moral hazard. That sets up a terrible incentive system where now they're always going to come back asking for more bailouts. But that's why, again, I'm of the belief that if you temporarily nationalize the industry and the taxpayer is the owner of last resort, then when the economy gets going better and there's reason to believe that we're on the right path, then you could hand it back over to private hands. But as of right now, and many other countries are doing this, if you temporarily nationalize the certain industries, that's the only way you could weather the storm. It's the only way. Because again, you could bail people out. You could bail out certain industries and keep them afloat for a little bit. But in due time, they're going to go belly up again because the economy's grinding to a halt. But what he was saying there in sort of a tongue-in-cheek way, like, why not do this and this and this? My reaction is actually correct. Those are probably the only things we should be doing. So, and the idea that Michael Knowles says there, oh, now you're setting a precedent of the government sending direct checks to people. We've had that precedent for a long time. It's called Social Security. So we set that precedent. We already set the precedent that the deficit is not necessarily a problem. Every modern economist will tell you the deficit is not necessarily a problem. You can get some Austrians who say, the opposite, but everybody who's a Keynesian, but beyond that, everybody, and the acting ideology at the Federal Reserve is MMT, modern monetary theory. And all of them will tell you the deficit is not necessarily the problem. The problem is inflation. So as long as we can control inflation, we can do as much deficit spending as we want, assuming we have control of our own currency. And thankfully here in the U.S. we do. We have our own currency. So there's a lot of stuff there that's fascinating. Charlie says, well, the best stimulus is really to get people back to work. Yeah, but there's a pandemic. So they can't go back to work. That's the point. So what do we do in the meantime? Well, the proposals that, are the clear ones, in my opinion, you freeze all the major bills, put a total freeze on rent, mortgage, student loans, all the major ones, and then give everybody a UBI check every single month, and they could use that to pay for the bills that are not frozen. So you basically press pause on the economy. And in terms of the bailout bill, he and I would agree on the corporate side of the bailout bill. I would not bail out the corporations, but I would effectively do a bailout of the people. And the logic is, hey, when there's a crisis, the government has to act because they have to look out for, as the Constitution says, the general welfare of the American people. So I would just flip that right on its head, just like Charlie alludes to there, and say, well, if there's a liquidity crisis and if there's the financial industry immediately gets bailed out and gets $1 trillion a day in quantitative easing when there's a problem, why don't we view the health crisis as a crisis? So why can't you use the same mechanisms instead of $1 trillion a day to prop up the financial institutions in Wall Street? Why not spend the money for Medicare for all? Because in my opinion, having 45,000 to 68,000 people die every year because they don't have access to basic health care, there's your crisis. You want to know another crisis? About 500,000 homeless people. That's a crisis. So the government should be the last line of defense. And even though he doesn't mean it when he says it at the end there, I think he's correct. He's like, well, now, see, you've set a precedent, and the precedent is the government could just spend whatever whenever they want for whatever reason, and this sets up a problem. Well, it's only a problem because our government is corrupt, so they're spending the money in all the wrong ways. If they weren't corrupt and they just spent the money on the actual crises, that'd be wonderful. That would be a thriving social democracy. So, almost, Charlie, almost. You were so close. So close. But he said it. He's like, well, if we could afford this ridiculous bailout bill, well, why can't we afford Medicare for all? Why can't we afford UBI? Correct, Charlie. Correct. That, but unironically.